tutorial will dye cotton fabric with pink and red camellia flowers. My research indicated that camellia pigment can produce pale shades of brownish pink depending on the mordant. I ended up dyeing with pink camellia petals first and then with red petals in a second batch. Neither batch ended up being brownish pink. The camellia shrub, Camellia japonica, grows in eastern and southern Asia from the Himalayas east to Japan and Indonesia. We have several mature camellia shrubs in our yard. For this project, I used basic dye equipment and a well-ventilated workspace. I used a soaking pot, a dye pot, a heat source, and a candy thermometer to keep the dye bath at a consistent temperature. I also used a strainer and cheesecloth to remove the petals from the dye bath. Supplies include camellia petals, sea salt, ferrous sulfate, lemon, a gallon of water, plus more as needed, prepared cotton fabric, scoured, gallnut mordant, and alum brightener. For safety, wear a face mask when working with powders and rubber gloves when working with soda ash, which is caustic. The weight of fabric was about 9 ounces, 259 grams. I typically dye dish towels, but this year I'm expanding to other cotton items. For each batch, I used 2 dish towels, 2 napkins, 2 large hankies, and 2 small hankies. The fabric was scoured and mordanted. I used a gallnut mordant followed by a bath of 15% WOF alum and 2% soda ash as a brightener. For the first batch, I used pink camellia flowers and followed instructions from Sarah Kay in her article, Camellia Dye. The weight of fabric was about 9 ounces or 259 grams. I collected about 12 ounces of pale pink camellia flowers from our yard in mid-February, so the WOF percentage was about 130%. The supplies for the first batch include 12 ounces pink camellia flowers, 2 teaspoons sea salt, 1/2 lemon, juice and rind, a gallon of water, plus 9 ounces prepared cotton fabric. The recipe called for salt, but in retrospect, it may not be needed since the fabric is mordanted with oak gallnut. I followed my typical extraction method. The pale pink petals were lovely. The dye bath was promising. It seemed to indicate that we were on track for a pale brownish pink. I soaked the fabric for an hour in the dye bath. I typically soak overnight. I rinsed the fabric thoroughly in cool water, washed and hung to dry. But instead of any shade of brownish pink, the fabric remained creamy white, no color at all. I had at least expected a pale tan color based on the dye bath. Experiments can lead to disappointment, but like Edison's many light bulb experiments, sometimes you discover what doesn't work. For the second batch, I used red camellia flowers. I reused the previously dyed fabric, which was already scoured and mordanted. I just rewashed it in Synthropol. The weight of fabric was about 9 ounces. This time I collected about 28 ounces of camellia flowers, so the WOF percentage was about 300%. I gathered the flowers throughout March and froze them to preserve the color. Camellia petals turn brown very quickly, but I included the brown petals anyway, thinking they may still have pigment. I also decided to use ferrous sulfate as a modifier. Modifiers change the color of the dye. Ferrous sulfate produces a grayish version of a color. We'll learn more about modifiers at another time. The supplies for the second batch include 28 ounces of red camellia flowers, 1 teaspoon ferrous sulfite, 1/2 lemon, a gallon of water, 9 ounces prepared cotton fabric. This time I omitted the salt. First, extract the dye using our basic process. Add petals and lemon to the pot, simmer for an hour, soak petals and strain them. Let's get started. Rinse the petals and pull them apart. Add the petals to a gallon of water in a stainless steel pot. Stir in juice of a 1/2 lemon and its rind. Bring to 180 to 200 degrees and simmer for an hour. Soak petals and lemon rind for 3 days. Strain petals out of dye bath using cheesecloth. Return the dye bath to the stainless steel pot. The resulting liquor is pale pink orange and smells like tea. Then dye the fabric using our basic process. Add ferrous sulfate and wet fabric to dye bath. Heat the dye bath and simmer for an hour. Soak fabric in the dye bath. Rinse and hang to dry. Add 1 teaspoon sulfate and stir well. Add wet prepared fabric and simmer for an hour, keeping the temperature between 180 and 200 degrees. Stir periodically to make sure dye is distributed as evenly as possible. Let soak for an hour or overnight. Since I love saturated color, I let it soak for 3 days this time. Squeeze out excess dye from the dish towels. Rinse the dish towels in cool water until the water runs clear. Run the dish towels through the washing machine's rinse and spin cycles using cold water. Let the towels air dry. 2 weeks later, wash the towels in pH-neutral soap like Synthropol and hang to dry. The resulting color is a soft grayish brown with hints of pale lilac in some light.